Thank you for joining me on the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, AZ. I find the research and resources and then provide the fire service with the so what, now what, to ensure the health and well-being of every member of our profession. Together, let's thrive. Hey listeners, it's AZ. Welcome back to episode 190, where I got to sit down with Dr. Jacob Mota and Mike Conner from Frontline Mobile Health, and we discussed the new NFPA standards or guidelines. So we discussed 1582 versus 1580 and all of the implications and considerations that went into those new policies. I really hope you enjoy this episode. Please send me a message on either social media or email me if you have any questions about the podcast or any feedback. Have a great day. Hey listeners, it's AZ. It's a very exciting day. I'm here with three-time guest, Dr. Jacob Mota. Say hello.
Hello.
And three-time guest, Mike Conner. Say hello.
Hello.
And the exciting part is they've never been guests together.
That's right.
Just so you know, gentlemen, you are nipping at the heels of Vanessa Frost and Megan Lautz, four-time guests.
Ooh.
So, I mean,
well, those are good goals to aspire to. Vanessa and Megan are both good dudes.
They're good dudes, and we'll see how today goes, because maybe, I don't know, just maybe you'll move into the top spot based on how the conversation goes. Just kidding.
Yeah.
No pressure.
No pressure. Before we hopped on, we were talking about FOMO and the fact I get to see Jake next week at the NSCA conference, and Jake gets to see Mike next week at Texas Tech, but we all three don't get to see each other. So I still have FOMO. It's kind of sad.
That's right. I'll get to see you in November at Science to the Station.
Science to the Station, right. I like how you said good dudes really quick. Mike, can you remind the listeners what the hell that means?
Yeah, so in our company culture, we try to say be good dudes to each other. And in the military, in the fire service, in life in general, when you tell somebody that, like, oh yeah, Jake's a good dude, you don't really have to go in depth into like understanding what that means. You just know, like, right away, like, okay, that's someone I can count on. That's someone whose advice I can seek for a particular thing. And it just has a universal meaning. And so that's just kind of how I refer to people.
And I have noted that I have been referred to as a good dude. So I'm very excited about that too. Thanks, Mike.
For sure.
Today, this has been a long time in the coming. Today, we're going to talk about, VO2 max. We're going to talk about NFPA. I almost said NSCA. That would have been embarrassing. NFPA.
Sure.
1582 and 1580. So let's start at the start. Let's start with Jake, if this is okay with Jake. Give us a reminder about what the hell even VO2 max is and why we give a shit in firefighters.
Yeah, I can field that one. VO2 max and why we give a shit in firefighters. To get everyone on the same page, VO2 max is a measure of how well the cardiovascular system can use oxygen, right? So whenever you take a big breath of air, assuming you're on planet Earth, you're going to breathe in about roughly 20% oxygen. There's a bunch of other stuff in the air, a bunch of nitrogen, some other stuff. But VO2 max is all about how well can the body pull that oxygen from the air and then put it where it needs to go in the body. In terms of why firefighters care, why any athlete cares, is oxygen is a primary fuel source for most things. We need oxygen to do anything that's going to take our bodies a long time to do. Think anything longer, if it's going to take you longer than 3 minutes, you're going to pretty much require oxygen in order to do it. So the better our bodies are at utilizing available oxygen, the longer that we're going to be able to do said activity before we have absolute fatigue occur. And fatigue is a problem for a number of reasons, right? We don't want to fatigue on the job because that may increase the danger for yourself, for other firefighters, or for civilians. You don't want to have fatigue during training because it's not fun. You feel bad. There's a lot of reasons to avoid fatigue. So we want a VO2 max that's high, or at least high enough so that we don't have fatigue very easily. So a higher VO2 max number is typically better, and we want to strive for more. There's always going to be some elite level athlete who's going to have a higher VO2 max than you or the three of us on this call, and that's okay. That it's totally okay. The goal isn't to have these outstanding VO2s of 60s and 70s and even maybe an 80. The goal is to have a little bit higher than what you need to do your normal things.
That is such a good answer. And I'm going to stick with you for just a second before we bounce to Mike, because I want you to talk, being the exercise dude, I want you to talk about what we can do as humans to improve our VO2 max.
That's a good question. Talk about like the world of controversy. The really funny thing about this, especially if you know me or if listeners know me at all, I'm actually a strength guy. So my background is really if you look at strength and conditioning, I'm on the strength side versus the conditioning side. I've always been leaning that direction. So when people come to me and talk about VO2 stuff, people who've known me for 10 years kind of look at me and give me the side eye like,
yeah,
you didn't want to talk about it 10 years ago. But the fun fact is
20 reps, right? 20 reps is cardio. That's how you increase your.
That's right. When I want to do cardio days, it's just squats with 15 to 20 reps. And argue with me not, your heart rate goes up pretty high. The data are what they are. But that's probably not the most efficient way to improve your VO2 max. Although it's challenging and it'll make your heart rate go up pretty good. There's a couple of trains of thought. So when it comes to improving your VO2 max, the no-brainers are going to be obviously, hey, go for a run, go for a walk, go for a ruck, go for a swim, go for a cycle, get on the Stairmaster. Those things will do a pretty good job. You get on them for a while, and you do them for 15 minutes here, 30 minutes there, maybe 45 minutes once a week. That type of very simple program is effective. There's another really, really popular train of thought in the last several years now, which is all the rage in zone 2 cardio. And I know, Mike, you love some zone 2 cardio. We've had a couple of phone calls on your zone 2 cardio sessions. And zone 2 cardio is incredibly effective, right? So what that comes down to is essentially you're going to be training for longer periods of time where your heart rate is elevated. It's slightly higher than what it is resting, but it's perhaps not working incredibly hard, right? You're not revving the engine super high. And the idea here is that you can hit this zone 2 for extended periods of time without taxing your cardiovascular system or your musculoskeletal system. And that's advantageous because if you do something that's really taxing all the time, hello injuries, hello overtraining, hello not liking doing what you're doing. So zone 2 cardio is a great thing. The other train of thought, and I'm partial to this because this is what my PhD dissertation was, is all about HIIT training, high intensity interval training. HIIT training is a really time efficient modality of exercise. I can get you to do an excellent training session in 20 minutes on a cycle ergometer by doing 1 minute on and 1 minute off. That the trick is though, that on period needs to be pretty intense. It's 1 minute of really heavy, intense training, and then 1 minute of rest. And we've shown that to be a really effective way to rapidly improve VO2 max in trained and untrained individuals. So those are kind of the three ways, but it comes down to training and doing something. You can't take a pill. You can't eat better. You can't eat your way to a good VO2 max. GLP-1s aren't going to get you there. It's training. It's getting, miles on your feet or on the cycle or however you want to get it done.
That was such a great answer. And also, I have now a show link to put in. Dr. Katie Hirsch talked about HIIT training a million years ago, so I'll put that show link in. So now we're going to the medical side of it with Mike.
Sure.
Because most departments aren't actually measuring VO2 max. They're doing this MET. Like, what are your METs? What did you get? So talk about the relationship between what the hell is a MET and what does it mean in terms of VO2 max?
Right. So I do want to preface this with, I do have some, I have changed the way I have thought about zone 2 training. Like zone 2 training is extremely important for establishing an aerobic base. right? And helping build that mitochondrial density in the muscles so that like you can clear things a little bit faster. You can have, but I do believe, and I strongly believe, and this is the way that I've trained for a long time, is that you have to be able to tap into that dark space from time to time. And that's what the HIIT training's for. That helps build mental resiliency. And like Jake talked about, right? Like it helps you peak your, so you don't have like this really flat aerobic, base capacity, but you don't have the ability to kind of move into that dark space from time to time, because you are going to have to rev the engine on the job when we're talking about firefighting and operational tactical athletes, that sort of stuff. The medical side, right? So the literature's been there for quite some time now. In the past 10 years, there's been a lot of talk. Anybody who listens to Dr. Peter Attia or, any of these other, Instagram influencers, the gym bros, that are big on the aerobic capacity training. We know that. So first of all, to address the first question, like what's a MET compared to a VO2? So 1 MET is equal to 3.5 mils per kg per minute, right? Which is your relative VO2. The kg is your body weight. And that's, if you're directly measuring. There's also an indirect measurement. Indirect measurements are a little inaccurate, especially when you're talking about heavier people, especially when you're talking about higher body fat, higher body weight, or BMI. You can start to really greatly overestimate VO2. So 1 MET, 3.5 mils per kg per minute. That's kind of the thing that 1582 and 1580 kind of look at. So why is aerobic capacity important? Well, they've done these big longitudinal studies, and they've discussed where 1 MET, right, increasing your aerobic capacity, just 1 MET, allows you to have a 13 to 20% decrease in not all cause mortality, but cardiovascular deaths, right? And what's the number one killer of firefighters on duty? Cardiovascular deaths, right? So that's why VO2 is such an important thing. Another thing that they looked at, there's this huge study, it's over 100,000 people, just moving from one bracket to the next decreases all-cause mortality by a significant amount, right? We're talking about, all-cause mortality, so neurodegenerative disease, strokes, heart attacks, cancer, surviving a car accident, having a fall in your home, that sort of stuff. So it does really, really matter medically. And I think where the confusion comes in, and we're like, Jake and I can kind of talk about stuff is, the medical side and the fitness side, and then the old standard and the new standard.
Yeah, that it gets overwhelming really quickly. And yeah. I'm already going down a rabbit hole because I want many of the departments that are doing self-evaluation. So they're using the Wellness and Fitness Initiative, and they're using the Gherkin protocol on their people. Talk about, Mike, for a second, how you said sometimes these relative measures of VO2 max grossly overestimate the VO2 max. Talk about Gherkin and just give me all the details on that.
Yeah, so Gherkin's a graded exercise protocol. You warm up for a couple of minutes. At minute 1, you go up an incline. At minute 2, your speed increases. At minute 3, and it just alternates, right? Speed, incline, speed, incline, speed, incline, until you tap out. I think the end of it is like 18 minutes. There's one guy at this department right here, Westlake, who routinely would max that thing every year. And he was he was a stud. He was an absolute stud. I mean, this guy was an absolute stud. Shout out to Seth Bonacary. But and his VO2 is well into the 50s and 60s, right? So he's an exceptionally fit firefighter. Now, for him, that's an accurate predictor of capability, right? He's a very fit, right? Long track history, long cycling history. So we know that that's a good predictor. Now, for somebody who is, I can't remember the study, but I know that the statistics came out to 20% overestimation on people whose BMI are above 30 to 35, right? That's not an insignificant overestimation, right? That is, if your METS level is 10, right, which if you look at the old standard, 10 was like, hey, you're good to be on the floor. You probably should get on a physical fitness program. Like if you subtract 20% from that on overestimation, they're like borderline at 8 METs, right? 8 METs was the floor. 8 METs was the determining line on the old standard that said, hey, you're unsafe. You're probably not going to make it. And we've all seen like tests where people are just struggle busing to get to that last that last 30 seconds, right? Kind of tapping on the handlebars and just like really, really struggling to get there. And that's kind of where the difference between the Gherkin protocol and a protocol that uses direct gas measurement using a metabolic cart, right, really, in my opinion, reduces the amount of risk and potentially saves lives, right? So we're talking about putting on a mask, right? You're getting your whether that's on a treadmill or a cycle ergometer, either one is going to tell you exactly how efficient you are, right? And I think that's where the intention was to make it accessible for everybody, but with the risk that's there, we probably need to invest into some of these pieces of equipment so that you're reducing risk as much as possible within the organization.
Amen. And I think you both alluded to 1582 and 1580. So, Jake, let's start with 1582. Tell me, how did this original number of 12, where did that come from? And how did they determine it? Tell me all of the facts that you know about that.
So the original 1582 standard, right? And maybe for the uninitiated or the people who aren't in the fire service, and NFPA 1582 is the National Fire Protection Agency standard 1582, which is the health and wellness instructions and policies. So the NFPA came up with some guidelines to say, hey, here is where we need the minimums to be at for firefighters to be operational. And here's kind of where, as Mike alluded to before, here's some floors where, hey, we need to start being concerned and we need to start pulling guys off ops. The 12 METs came about. The 8 METs came about as kind of some of these thresholds of where you're either really good to go or, hey, you're starting to have some problems. And then somewhere in that 8 to 10 MET range, the NFPA, and this I think the change happened somewhere in like 2005, 2010, started to make this recommendation to say, hey, if you're in this middle category, we see you kind of trending downwards from 10. We see 8s in your future. So we need to initiate not to use that F word, that fitness word. We need to implement some sort of wellness training to make you go from, instead of 10 to 8, maybe 10 to 12. I'm not exactly super confident on where the 12 METs comes from. There's a couple of studies that have tried to evaluate where firefighters are at during occupational tasks. And this is really interesting, and it's really hard to do this correctly. And I should have written this name down, and I didn't, so I apologize. But there's a couple of studies that have come out, and they really try to get at, hey, what is required in order to work a structure fire? We can have firefighters, either we can estimate how much a VO2 is required, or perhaps we can directly measure it in either a real world or simulated real world, or maybe a VR situation. So these early numbers started to come out, and the NFPA took them as a strong recommendation and kind of ran with them. However, the scientist in me, right, I'm all concerned about replication. And I think one neat finding is awesome, but one neat finding should be the beginning of a dozen subsequent studies. And unfortunately, we had one or two really neat findings in the field, and that's kind of where everyone stopped. And we stopped replicating this and stopped investigating things further. 10 METs, 12 METs, you're looking at mid 30s of a VO2, right? 10 METs comes out to about 35 mils per kg. You're not exactly, that's not really high. And we start to get in this interesting conversation, and Mike, jump in here, but we start to get at what's the difference between the performance VO2 required to do the job, right? So in order for you to work the structure fire, in order for you to work this vehicle collision, what VO2 do you need to work it? And then there's another column over here, and Mike's really opened my eyes to this, so credit to you, Mike. There's a separate column of, hey, but what's the VO2 you need in order to mitigate cardiovascular health, detriments health? Yeah. And those two numbers may not be the same. And that's where this conversation around these standards in general, before we get into conversating between 1580 and 1582, that's where this gets really interesting. Because is this going to be a standard that says, hey, this is the VO2 max required for you to do the job? Or is this a standard that we need to talk about, hey, this is the VO2 max you need in order to really concern ourselves with your longevity on in this career path? And those two don't always agree.
Yep.
Mike, riff on that. I know you got a lot to say.
Yeah. So, when we look at somebody who has a VO2 of, let's use, 10 as an example, 35. Yeah. Like that may be the required, I think Emily Langford's pub, she put people on VO2 masters and had them like do occupational tasks, right? And it was somewhere around like 35, 37 mils per kg per minute. If I'm wrong, Emily or Mark, please, throw down and, in a comment or something. But that's fine, right? But what is going on to their heart? What is going on to their respirations? What's going on to their O2 pulse, right? Like these are things that we're trying to look at when our clinic does cardiopulmonary exercise testing, right? Like there's so many different things, right? Just because someone like it's like the 12 med example on the treadmill, right? If you are struggle bussing and you're throwing PVCs, right? You've got other things going on medically.
But I got there, Mike.
But I made the standard, right? And that's where, we have to like really pay attention to these things medically, and where I feel like a little bit better diagnostic testing. Now, is there an occupational requirement? Absolutely. Right. And Jake and I have, I'll throw this back to Jake here in a minute. Jake and I have talked about this previously, right? Like Joel Martin published a big meta-analysis recently that showed that for occupational task tests, the absolute VO2, not relative VO2, is a better predictor of occupational performance, right? So, and that is totally in keeping with what you see in the field, right? Like you'll have, I can think of a guy who's like 6'4" and 250 pounds and just a solid hoss, right? And he's cranking out like over 400 watts on a bike, but his VO2 is only like 34 or 35 because he's so big, right? But his relative VO2 is ginormous, right? Like his liters per minute is massive because he's just moving air. And his ability to move on the fire ground and carry heavy things is significantly different than someone who weighs, like $160 or $150 who may be struggle busing. So, but when you compare their absolute VO2s together, they're identical. Right. So they're going to be able to do the same task. And that's where sometimes, that's where I feel like 1580 did a really good job of saying, hey, fire chiefs, you are the final authority for adjudicating, right? Because that comes into play when we're talking about aerobic capacity. That if you know that, you've got this big hoss that can move on the fire ground and get the work done, but he's not meeting the VO2 requirement, then you know for a fact, right, that there is something that he is capable of doing the job without meeting the VO2 requirement. That's a bit controversial, but again, on the medical side, you have to look at other things, right? You have to look at what's going on the tracings. How is his ventilation looking? How's his O2 pulse? Family history, medications, those sorts of things play a big factor in all of this.
So what you're saying, Mike, is that Big Hoss, I love that term, by the way, Big Hoss is able to get the job done due to his relative VO2 max, but also you're looking at his other health indicators too. You're looking at his blood pressure. You're looking at everything else and seeing the big picture. Like Big Hoss is also healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Does he have an exaggerated blood pressure response, right? Is he throwing bigeminy or trigeminy towards the end of peak exercise, right? Those are signs of badness. And we want to make sure that those things aren't happening. But if he's getting it done, then he's getting it done, right? Like there's, so that's where the VO2 stuff starts to get a little controversial in the firefighting space and the tactical space.
Maybe this like is also a side into a different conversation that in my world is every day, but in the fire service, it's never discussed. And that is the difference between relative VO2 and absolute VO2. With all the standards, it's always relative VO2. And for everyone, so relative VO2, Mike described this earlier, the units here are very important. Relative VO2 is milliliters per kilo per minute. So it's milliliters of oxygen per kilogram body mass per minute. That's how much fuel that you're essentially putting into your body. This is important because it's quote unquote relative to your body mass. That's where that kilo part of the metric comes in. But we actually will make that calculation after we calculate absolute VO2. Absolute VO2 is irregardless of your body mass. The units with absolute VO2 are in liters per minute. So it's how much bulk air you're moving on the liter per minute mark. You're thinking, it depends on your body size, but you're thinking somewhere on the lower end, 3.5 liters, and upwards in the higher end, maybe 4.5, maybe somewhere up to 5 if you're really, really bigger, particularly dudes. I heard this phrase once in grad school. I think Eric Trexler may have said it, or Greg Nuckols, but the idea came around that relative VO2 max is crazy because it absolutely is biased against bigger people. So if you are a larger man or woman, right, and that includes if you have more body mass from fat or skeletal muscle, if you're larger, the larger that you are, the harder that relative equation comes into play, because all you're doing with the relative equation is dividing out your absolute by your body mass. So the more that you have to divide out that absolute by, the lower your relative VO2 is. So when I go for a run, and I'm a somewhat of a larger guy, right? My driver's license says I'm 6 foot, and I'm about 215 to 220 pounds. So I'm somewhere in there. When I go for a run, it is energetically costly for me to run because I'm over 200 pounds. Comparatively, when I completed my dissertation, I withered away to about 185 pounds. If I went for a run then, regardless of what my cardiovascular system looked like, I weighed 30 pounds less than I do now. So my relative VO2 gets a nice bump. So this idea of absolute VO2 and how it may be a better indicator of on the fireground performance is precedented. It's something that matters. You can have these hosses come in with a relative poor relative VO2, but their absolute VO2 is so high that they can consume the oxygen to do the job. Yep. And they can get it done, and they can do really, really well. And that is irrespective of the fact that they have a poor relative VO2, which is where the standards come in.
Yeah, and it's all that non-metabolically active tissue, right? Like that's kind of the nice way of calling body fat. It's all the non-metabolically active tissue that really weighs you down, pun intended, in terms of your VO2, right? Like, I mean, we looked at, we worked with Grant Tinsley and published that paper. I don't think it's out yet in JOEM, but it's going to be open access. We looked at body fat, and we looked at body fats of firefighters, body fats of male and female firefighters, kind of like normalize the range, right? So percentile based, did the same thing for VO2. And, we did kind of a little further analysis and like the impact that body fat has on VO2. It's totally like, it makes sense, right? It's common sense. But it's just so impressive to see whenever you see this massive impact that body fat has on VO2. And that's something that's kind of a little frustrating for me because we're told to collect it, right? But what are you collecting it for? Because there's no negative, there's no recourse, right? Like it's like there's nothing that says, it's not like the military, right? Like in the Army, we had this thing where it was like, hey, if your body fat's too high, it's going to start causing injuries. You're not going to be fit on the job. It's going to start impairing your ability for cardiorespiratory fitness. Sorry, I went down a rabbit hole, but there is an impact, right? And that's where I feel like VO2 is important, but we should also be looking at things like lean muscle mass, skeletal muscle mass, maybe taking a harder look at liters per minute, absolute VO2 versus relative VO2, and then starting or initiating some sort of a standard, right, based on large data sets.
And to go back what you said before, Mike, so the fire chief has the ability to make these calls. And the fire chief doesn't require the NFPA to guide them on each and every step. The body fat percentage is an excellent metric to examine for firefighters across the board. It is a great health metric. This one is simple. You want it lower. The lower that you can get it, the better. For men, for women, for old, for young, it doesn't matter. You probably want it lower. There's an extreme to that, right? I'm not saying that everyone should chase this magical 0% body fat. Don't do that. But if you're 30% and you're saying that's not so bad, I'm not 40. Yeah, you're right. You're not 40, but you're also not 15. And I think this is an easy metric for a lot of fire departments to really start to look at. And like you said, Mike, to create its own standard. Because you can have someone with a higher percent body fat, but also just ruck it out that for that VO2 master and knock it out. But that doesn't mean that one metric tells the entire story. And so the point of that little rant is the fire chief has the ability to examine multiple metrics. The VO2 max is an excellent one, by all means. Body fat percentage is another great one. And then in my world, we get at muscle strength too. And then we won't go down that rabbit hole because I'll just get all sorts of hot and bothered and I won't stop. But there's multiple metrics that should be considered for performance and health.
We're going to keep you on your soapbox, Jake, because so 1582 had the 12 and the 8 METs. And then you said in the early 2000s, they added in the 10, like, hey, probably better be thinking about this. So why did anyone even reconsider this whole system? Like, why did we recreate the wheel? Can you go into that?
All right, so why did we go from the NFPA 1582 into now the contemporary 1580? That's kind of the question.
Yeah.
What an excellent segue into this, right? I'm pretty pro of I'm like a weird walking issue, right? I don't like change, but I also don't want to avoid change.
You would be a great firefighter.
Yeah. Well, I used to be, remember? So it's never gone away.
True.
It's stuck in my blood. Ask all of my graduate students, ask my wife. They will all support that. So the idea here came about that, hey, maybe these absolute thresholds, or rather maybe these hard thresholds, to get away from the absolute term, of 12 METs or 10 METs or 8 METs, maybe that's not good enough for a very diverse firefighter population across the U.S. Maybe we should be looking at something and appreciating more that, hey, the average male firefighter may have a greater VO2 max innately, biologically, than a female. Maybe we should consider that. Hey, maybe the older adults, they also have a different VO2 max than the young bucks. And so this came about, quite frankly, for that. And that's fair. There's a lot of rationale in the exercise physiology world to support that, because guess what? As you age, VO2 max goes down, just like muscle strength, just like your body composition. As you age, things change. As I get into my mid 30s, I've realized it more and more every day.
You're such a young puppy.
You both give me the look.
That's cute.
That's really cute, Jake.
Thank you. Wait till you see my gray hairs next week.
Okay.
So that's the premise, right? So the new 1580 standards separate by age and sex. So there are age and sex specific VO2 requirements. What you have for a 20-year-old male is going to be different than what you have for a 20-year-old female. We have for a 30-year-old female is going to be different than we have for a 60-year-old male. Now, these standards, I believe, were essentially taken from the American College of Sports Medicine textbook, which is good. And I'm not dogging them at all. It's an excellent resource. And they made a good decision there. It's validated. It's oriented towards these age and sex related changes. The interesting part, though, came about of where do you draw the line, right? So before we had these lines at 8 and 10 and 12. And now it's like, okay, well, where does the line get here? So essentially what happens with the new standard is the line was drawn at the 50th percentile mark. So across age and sex, it comes out to about the 50th percentile as is the new quote unquote 12 METs. That now becomes an interesting discussion point of what is the 50th percentile for a younger person versus an older person, and how does that relate to the VO2 required to do operations? How does that relate to VO2 required to optimize health? Those are interesting discussion points we can go down.
My first question, Jake, is I'm all about, like, as an aging female, I mean, I'm mid-30s now too.
Of course.
Of course. No, but it makes sense. Inherently, it makes sense. But also, on the other hand, it makes no sense to me at all, because a firefighter is a firefighter and we all have to do the same job. So I think the first rabbit hole we should maybe go down is, Mike, you have a lot of data that you've analyzed retrospectively, correct?
Yeah. Just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Talk about what the story that data, this is a terrible question. Tell us the story that the data is relaying to you.
I will elucidate the mysteries of aerobic capacity.
Thank you. That's what I wanted you to do. Thank you.
All right. So when we were following the old standard, as you aged, you were less likely to pass the standard, right? So if you're in your 20s, 30s, you're typically doing pretty good. You had like a fail rate of like the low teens in that age category, right? Especially in your 20s, right? Because your aerobic capacity is smoking high. Your lungs aren't getting stiff. Your intercostals aren't stiff, right? You can move air efficiently. Your body composition hasn't changed. Probably in the best shape of your life. And then when we changed over to the new standard, and this actually started in late 2023, it was December of 2023, this new thing came out and said, hey, we're no longer using 8, 10, and 12 METs. We're using 35th percentile and 50th percentile as standards for passing your test. Something weird happened, right? And shout out to Alex, who really started, bringing my attention to it. But like our 20-year-olds were failing, right? And our older people were passing at a much higher rate. And so we continued to collect this data over time. And I said, hey, Jake, check this out. And it was like a Power BI graph, right? So, we don't have fancy statistical tools like R. With visualization plugins that Jake geeks out about, right? So I send him our data, and about a week later, he shoots me a text and he's like, dude, you won't believe this. And I was like, what? And he's like, at first, whenever we ran the data, I thought it was like you were 2 times or maybe like 3 times more likely. Do you remember this conversation, Jake?
I do.
And I was like, yeah, I mean, that sounds reasonable. And he's like, no, man, like when you run it, if you're a 30-year-old, you're more than 20 times more likely to pass your aerobic capacity test than if you were in your 20s. And it just goes up, right? So 40s, 50s, 30 times, 37 times, right? Like we're talking magnitudes higher of being able to pass your test. Now, the concern on the medical side is, what is the difference between a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old? Well, what is the biggest unmodifiable risk factor for cardiovascular disease?
Oh, I know.
What's that?
Age.
That's right. So you're increasing your risk as you get older, but you're 37 times more likely to pass your aerobic capacity testing if compared to your 20s. So it just didn't make sense. And that's where we started, we talked about it at IPES when we saw you guys out there at Oklahoma State with Jay and Rob and all those folks out there. And, Peyton presented the data. And it's really just kind of shocking, right? Like the guys who have the highest risk, and this goes back to, I got curious, right? And I'm nosy and I'm curious and I like to ask questions, which probably makes me, an irritating person. But I looked at the U.S. Fire Administration's website and I looked at their causes of death due to cardiovascular disease, right? And then I sorted it by age. 98% of line of duty deaths attributed to cardiovascular disease were over the age of 30. 98%, right? So we've taken this standard, kind of flipped it around and said, hey, medically, you're good if you can do these things at this level, right? So that's what we saw in our data, and that's kind of what we've noticed, and that's kind of the concern.
So to be clear, at the outset of the conversation, I think Jake brought it up. We want this capacity to do work.
Mm-hmm.
We want the standard, but we also have to reconcile that with how healthy do you need to be to do the job?
Right.
But also in the middle of the conversation, we recognize that as you age, things just, they don't work as well anymore. I'm just going to tell you. So now, I mean, can I say clusterfuck on my own podcast? I'm going to say it. This is a clusterfuck.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there was some intention. I think there was some intentionality behind it, right? Like, and Jake can talk about this, right? Like the IAFF was concerned about people not being able to meet standards. Because if you look, like, Jake, can you remind us what the average age of a firefighter is?
Should be about 39.
Yeah. So you're already at a higher age, right? So we've talked about how aerobic capacity diminishes over time. So I think there was this fear of not just operational impact, but also institutional knowledge, right? So like, hey, how can we mitigate the loss of operations and the loss of institutional knowledge? And I'll turn it over to Jake and kind of riff on that.
Yeah, and I think it's a hard battle, right? So if you put yourself in the leadership shoes of these big organizations who are trying to drive the ship, I think that's a genuine concern. We don't want to have a standard that's set so high that the second that you're 42 years old, all of a sudden you're not good enough to be a part of us anymore. Unless you're an elite level athlete, yada, yada, yada. I don't think that needs to be the case. And I think that's where these organizations are trying to be very careful. And the last thing I would want is to have a firefighter with 20 years of on-the-job experience, with tons of training and tons of know-how to bring to the younger crews. I don't want that guy or gal gone, because the firefighters need that person, the public needs that person, the administration needs that person. That person is needed. But right now, and Mike didn't misspeak earlier, we're talking about changes in the likelihood of passing these standards that are not just a little bit higher. They're magnitudes. They're 20 and upwards of 30x, right? As soon as you become 30 years old, it is dramatically easier for you to pass this test. And what's the difference between a 30-year-old and a 29-year-old?
Yeah.
Not much.
Yeah.
Not much, right? Yet for that 30-year-old, it's much easier for them to make their yearly exam comparatively. So I've always been biased and looked at this from the younger person standpoint. If you're a 25-year-old and you're trying to make it on to a career as a firefighter, you have to bust it. You've got to crush it. You have to be training 4, 5, 6 days a week, maybe more. You've got to make sure your nutrition's dialed in. You're an athlete. Act like it. Bust it. Earn it. All the things. But if you're 35, train a couple days a week, eat okay, drink, just drink on the weekends, be all right. That's a crazy thing to really think about, because you have these young bucks that you're going to rely on for your next generation of firefighters, yet you're going to screen a large chunk of them out because the requirements are frankly high to be a young firefighter, or rather a young fire recruit, and have your VO2 max is dramatically higher than a 35-year-old, and much, much more egregiously than maybe a 40 or 50-year-old. Mike's side of the conversation, we kind of, have that nice flip-flop of the coin. His goes the other way of, okay, well, now you're going to have this 50-year-old who's on ops with a VO2 max of, say, 30. I forget exactly what the odds are. I tried to pull them up a second ago. VO2 max in the low 30s is their cutoffs. Their risk of having some sort of myocardial event on scene goes up dramatically. And that's a big concern we're all concerned about. Everyone that's in this world, fire service or researchers or medical professionals, we don't want that to happen, because that's the big killer for firefighters. Yet the standard isn't reflecting that. And if anything, the standard may make it a little confusing, because you may have these young guys who have to bust it, and then they look over in the gym, or they look over in the station, and you've got the older guys just hanging out. How do you manage that? How do you go about that? How do you justify that? I don't know.
Well, let's throw a little another iron in the fire and talk about Keely's paper where she showed that basically you could be older, fatter, and in less good condition and still get the job done. So there's that aspect of it too, right?
Yes. So Keely was my PhD student. She
Hey,
graduated
Keely.
a couple months ago. Shout out to Keely. She's now an assistant professor at University of Cincinnati. So she's over there building her lab as we speak. Yeah, I think that makes a really interesting point. What we try to highlight with the paper is, how does years of experience play a role? Going back to that institutional knowledge, how does a firefighter who just knows how to get it done? They move a little better. They know how to be efficient with their movements. They know what this is going to feel like, so they're not anxious about it. They know what it's like to be on air while it's a little warm. They've had these experiences. You can't deny that. I've worked with many 45-year-old firefighters who have seen a thing or two and are sitting on air as relaxed as can be, no problems. And then you look next door and you've got a 26-year-old firefighter who's in great shape, but is a bit nervous, understandably. They see the live burn going on. They're a little excited. Their adrenaline's up a little bit. Their heart rate's elevated. Yeah, they're ready to get in there, and it's exciting and it's fun. And I've been there, and I think it's awesome too. But that older firefighter is a bit more conservative, saying, well, I know what's to come. I'm going to save my energy. I'll turn it up when I need to. You can't buy that knowledge.
I used the analogy with Connor yesterday. You guys maybe haven't seen the movie Fried Green Tomatoes, but the gist of what I was telling Connor was Kathy Bates is a middle-aged woman, overweight, and she's trying to find a parking spot. And this hot young chick in a convertible, goes into her spot. So Kathy Bates just basically runs the hell out of her car. And the chick is like, "What are you doing?" And Kathy's like, "I'm older and I have better insurance. I can afford it." But it's the same kind of a thing with these, we won't use older firefighters, seasoned professionals. So, Connor, what is the answer? What do we do with all this information?
Yeah. So on the medical side, so we have to have a clear distinction between medical and occupational requirements, right? On the medical side, we really should be, I do think that there should be a floor, honestly, right? Like a great example is a 50-year-old female has to have a METS level just below 5, I think, whenever you look at the cycloergometer test. But, a 20-year-old who's on the job has to get 12.6 or something like that. I think that's the way it works out. But that's clearly not fair. That's clearly not in keeping with the one job, one standard. I think on the medical side, what we really need to be looking at is what's going on in their physical, right? Are they hypertensive, right? Which are things that 1580 does address, right? Hey, if you've got hypertension, you've got to be in this bracket. If you've got type 2 diabetes, you've got to be in this bracket. If you've got a history of a heart attack, you've got to be in this bracket. So you do fall into a higher bracket, which I think is fine, but the bracket's still pretty low as you age, right? The bracket is still pretty significantly low as you age. I think what you also have to do is you probably need to do better diagnostic testing, right? So, cardiopulmonary exercise testing's a really good one. Everyone can take a look at South Metro and see what they're doing up there. They're doing some amazing stuff with their people, right? Like cardiac CTs, they've got a well-established program. They're doing aerobic capacity, and their standards are higher, right? If you look at South Metro's aerobic capacity standards, they're higher than what we have in 1580. And that's another thing too, right? Is that it's okay to be different than 1580. It's a guideline, right? You can have a higher standard as an organization. You can say hey, no, we're not going to switch to this new standard. We can still follow the 8, 10, and 12, we can have some additional writing inside there. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that you really need to take a good hard look at, what is going on during the testing that you're doing and use that as the framework, right? And then you need to, if you're creating a new program, you really have to spend a year or two collecting data, right? Right. You have to spend a year or two looking at people's VO2s, looking at their body fat, looking at correlations to work comp injuries, looking at correlations to OJIs, all that other stuff, and use that as your metric, right? Because there's nothing wrong with creating your own standard, because you don't want to negatively impact your organization's operational readiness by immediately instituting, like, hey, everyone here on the job is going to be required to have a 60 mil per kg per minute VO2 and, a super clean everything. You have to work with what you have, right? You go to war with the army that you have. You don't go to war with the army that you wish for. It's kind of a popular saying that we have in the military.
I want to repeat this because I see this mistake made a lot in departments and agencies. They want to start. I'm throwing something at the wall and I want to get started. And what Mike said is really important. You have to spend a minimum of, I think, 2 years collecting data, sometimes longer, and figure out, what does this mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean and what's the implication?
Normalize it. Have somebody who understands the job too. I think that's so important. I can't tell you how many organizations that have worked with us that are just kind of blown away with what we do, just because we just took some of the stuff that we did in the military and applied it towards, right? Like, I know that if a pilot had shoulder surgery, he can't do emergency landing procedures because he can't raise his hand up to shut things down, right? So I know that hey, until you've got the strength to move controls up here and push buttons up here just fine. So we just took the same thing, right? This isn't a high school physical that, you're going to be getting. You can't be compared to the girl who's trying to get cleared for soccer for her varsity tryout. You have to be compared with understanding these are the essential firefighting tasks. I'm going to have to drag somebody out of a house, victim rescue, throwing ladders, dragging a charged line, breaching. All of those things need to be taken into consideration. And then, like you said, right, you have to spend a couple of years. You can't just suddenly throw up a standard and expect somebody to meet it. You have to graduate them into that process, right? Because not everyone's going to meet the standard right off the bat, but you have to give people a chance to meet the standard.
Mike mentioned it, and Jake, I want you to dig into it a little bit further. The fire chief does have some latitude, or has all of the latitude basically, to take it or leave it. And so what could that look like? So let's say I'm still on the job. I'm now a 54-year-old female. I'm not meeting the standards that are set forth. What could it look like to keep me on the job?
I think that's a great question. And that's, so where can the fire chief come into play? What can they do? What options do they have? Well, it's their organization at the end of the day. I recognize that as a person who's not a fire chief, but as a leader in our organization, we want to make good calls for the people under us, but we also don't want to make the wrong call. And so sometimes we're kind of biased toward just making, this is the way we've always done it kind of a call, or this is what the big crew above us does, so we're going to do what they do, right? This is what the Metro does. This is what the national group does, whatever. But the fire chief has to understand that it doesn't matter. This is their organization. And Mike said that. This is their culture. This is their guys and gals that they're in charge of. So if you have a female, and like your completely hypothetical example, who is saying, hey, here's my VO2, maybe it's a little substandard, the fire chief has a couple options. One, they can immediately pull that person off truck and say goodbye. Not something that I'd recommend you do, right? But that is an option. Two, you could have that fire chief say, okay, hey, maybe they didn't make the NFPA 1580 standard, but how are the rest of their things looking? What is their body fat percent looking like? How's their strength? How's their movement? Are they otherwise healthy? And this is just a fluke. Maybe they had a bad day, right? Remember, VO2 max tests are difficult. They require you to be pretty primed and ready to do if you happen to have a bad day. For instance, my daughter was up until 2 a.m. last night, and it wouldn't have been a great day for me to wake up and do a VO2 max test today. It just is what it is. Maybe that's
How about
what
a
happened.
Wingate? Let's do a Wingate.
Brutal.
Just kidding. Continue.
So I think the fire chief has to look at this, or maybe it's a battalion chief who's in charge, just whatever. They have to look at these individuals and start taking them a little bit more case by case. What other data do I have about this person? Is this a pattern? Is it a beginning of a trend downwards that we're seeing here? And that's what this is really seeing? Or is this a one-off where, hey, let's maybe retest in 6 months. Don't change anything. Let's just do it again. Maybe, I don't know, this kind of a novel thing, but maybe have the leadership talk to the person, and you go and have the conversation and build that rapport, and you say, hey, what's going on? Was that a pretty fair assessment for you, or were you having a bad day? Was your kid up? Did you have something happen last night and today's just not, or whenever you tested wasn't a good day? Maybe that initial conversation, stealing from my background as a strength and conditioning coach, just talking to the athlete, you get a lot of insight on how they're doing. Now, you may have the athlete or firefighter come to you and say, yeah, it was a bad day. Everything else is good. I could test today and I could probably do better. And that could be the case. You could have the athlete come to you and say, yeah, it was a bad day. And they completely lie through your teeth. All those things can happen, but you can't just immediately look at these and say, oh yeah, didn't make the VO2 max threshold, can them immediately. It starts the conversation. Look at the other metrics. Look at the person as an entire being and understand, are they ready to do this job? Yes or no?
That's something that like I want to jump on to, right? Like bad days, like, a large metropolitan department that we work with, we've kind of internally created this policy that like, hey, if you worked a fire overnight, like you're not getting tested that day, right? Just because like you're smoked, literally, like you're trash. You've had disturbed sleep. So they don't come in and do their testing whenever that kind of stuff happens. And that stuff happens sometimes, right? And then something else that Jake talked about is patterns, right? So I do believe that the military does it right? Like we have occupational testing, we have fitness testing, and we have medical testing, right? That is something that commanders can always use to adjudicate problems, right? Like if you've got a borderline soldier who's barely passing their fitness test, barely passing their MOS skills testing, and like not passing, like that's clearly an indication that something's going on and that you need to intervene. It's the same thing for the fire service, right? Like, does the department have like some sort of occupational testing, right? Like, do they have a consumption test? Do they have a pack walk? Do they have all these other things, right? Do they have a physical fitness test that do they do a 2K row, right? Is this person like knocking down all the freaking warning signs, right? Like they're failing their medical, they're failing their fitness, they're failing to like, then hey, yeah, absolutely, right? It's time for intervention, time to get them on the path to wellness. But if it's just like Jake said, a bad day, but he smoked his occupational test and he crushed his 2K row, then give that person an opportunity to retest if they need to retest, right? Like I think that can be easily mitigated just through by having additional data points.
I am going to add in the show notes a link to contact Vanessa for her manifesto, but she does a great job with those multiple test points per year. I think she has, in addition to the medical, I think she has 3 additional. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, you got to give people, and I talk about this whenever we consult on policy for health and wellness. Like you can't throw it all at them in November and December, right? Like you have to keep the target moving, right? Like you have to have occupational testing in March, probably do some fitness testing in July or August, and then do your medical testing in November, December, right? Because then people know, like, I've got something else coming up. And it's kind of a nice way to just ensure that your crews and your people are continuing to work out and stay healthy.
Amen. Preach it louder. So I want to be respectful of your time, but also make sure that we completely cover the topic. So I'm going to hop to Jake for a moment. Sure. Jake, is there something that we definitely should have talked about that I just blew off that you can think of?
I don't know if it's something that we should have talked about with blew off, but something that's been kind of on my mind as we're kind of at this tail end of this conversation. If you're a fire chief or a fire administrator, you may hear this and you may sit back and say, well, shit, how do I make a call? you're telling me I've got to understand the medical side, the health and wellness side, the athlete side. Like, I'm fire chief. I'm here to help manage the fire department. I don't want to start a degree in exercise physiology. I don't want to start a medical degree. Like, how can I make these calls? And frankly, the fire chief cannot. At least no fire chiefs that I've worked with personally have ever had this wide breadth of expertise where they can do all the things themselves. I encourage fire administrators to find that extra resource, right? Vanessa is an excellent example of this kind of new trend where you have a strength and conditioning professional, right? An actual professional who knows how to program, who knows exercise selection, which is all these things are arts. Not someone who is just good at X workout or who's a good CrossFitter or who's a good marathon runner. Not someone who's in the department who just happens to have a six pack, a dedicated strength and conditioning professional with training and experience to make these calls. I think they are an invaluable resource. Then you start to tack on medical professionals with very similar backgrounds. Then you have a fire chief who has several resources that he or she can have around them to make good calls. And I think that's the future of the fire service, where I see, in the next 10 years, I see a lot more of Vanessa's around. Because Vanessa is fantastic, but she's one person, and I wouldn't recommend Pflugerville to let her escape at all. I think every major fire department across the states needs a dedicated Vanessa, or Vanessa needs to, figure out how to make a Vanessa GPT, and then I guess everything will be okay. But until then, a fire department should invest in these people to help them in organizations. And there's a great precedent for the fire chief to be able to have those resources so that they can make good decisions, good educated decisions, and not have to go off and get a second degree in night school.
Yeah, there's proof of concept now. We're seeing it work in Pflugerville, in Fairfax County, in South Metro, in
Fort Worth.
Fort Worth.
Yeah. Oh my God, how did I forget about Brian?
Yeah.
So sorry, Brian. Proof of concept, it works. And the other thing that I think that we need to acknowledge, please, it's been at least 4 years ago now that I said it, but I said within 10 years, I think every major agency will have a health and wellness person. So Jake said 10, I said 10 4 years ago. So I think it's within 6. So mark those words. We'll see.
I'd be happy by 2030. I think that's great.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I think that the more traction, really where you really need to, people need to start doing this is you need to start talking to risk managers, right? Risk managers run all of your insurance. They run all your work comp, right? Get a grant, right? Get a grant, apply for an AFG, start a health and wellness program, get a grant, hire somebody on that grant, and then have the historical data, right? Have that historical data from your work comp person and your risk manager and show like, hey, after integrating this program, this is what I think we're going to see, right? And it shows value over time. It always shows value over time. But you just have to spend the money up front. Now, we talked about these big, large departments, right? What about the small 20, 30, one or 1.5 station departments? I think that there's still opportunity there. It's just more of a fractional thing, right? Like in the corporate world, you have fractional CFOs, you have fractional CEOs that will run companies and kind of guide them towards what they need to do. I think that there's an opportunity for fractional stuff on the health and wellness and strength and conditioning side, right? It's consulting. It's once a quarter. They come in, they test, they evaluate, right? It's not a full-blown salary for that time. It's like maybe a quarter to a half of a salary over time that helps you establish these programs. And some of these departments that really want to have change, but they don't have the budget for those things. So I think that's how you also have to frame these things as well too, right? It's not just about these big metro departments or these big like 200 person departments. What about the, the one to 3 station departments that has like 20 to 50 people?
Get out of my brain, Conner. That's what I always say too. Sharing resources. Did you have any final thoughts, Mike?
No, I think everything starts with a solid policy. I think that if you don't have a policy in place, then you've got to start there, right? Like look to your brothers and sisters in the like look to the fire chief that's down the road that has a solid policy and say, hey, what did you start with, right? Like, oh, hey, we started with this, and then start brainstorming, right? Like put it down on paper, kick it back to a couple other fire chiefs, talk to professionals like Jake, like AZ, like me that have helped written these policies that can help with that type of stuff. And it starts with a policy, and the policy has necessary components for people that, hey, this is what you need to stay on operations. And if you fall off of operations, this is the timeline and what's required for you to come back to operations. I think a lot of policies really miss that back half, right? Like, hey, what are you supposed to do if you become medically unfit for duty? Right? Well, what happens if you miss like 2 months of work because you've got to go through all these procedures, right? Like you've got to get recertified and all your stuff, right? Like you have to have a very clear path for all of these things to get back to work once you find problems. And remember, organizations don't want to lose people. They have invested so much freaking money in training, equipping, and manning, right? They have spent an obscene amount of money of putting people through academies, outfitting them, getting 2 sets of bunker gear, getting the right training, making them EMTBs, teaching them how to go through all that stuff, an entire cadre. So they don't want to just kick you out of the force. They want to retain you for as long as possible. So don't when you hear this podcast, don't be like, well, they're just trying to take my job. It's like, no, that's not it, man. The community and the organization has invested so much in you that they just want to make sure that you can retire on your own terms.
I will put the link in the show notes to Connor's episode where he talked about policy. Also, I have made a lot of promises about links in the show notes, and my notes are a mess. So we're going to cross our fingers there. Listeners, if there's something I said I would link that I didn't link, please let me know. I think this was a great conversation, and I think we can probably drop the mic. What do you think?
Yeah, I think this is great. AZ,
Yeah.
Thanks for giving us this opportunity to really highlight NFPA standards. It's something that's important, and it will have dramatic implications, or can have some dramatic implications for the day-to-day firefighter. This isn't one of those things, these policy things that are so high level that the daily firefighter is not going to notice. This can make a pretty big impact. But the fire chief has the ultimate authority to determine how it makes the impact. Ultimately, I think the NFPA is trying to help. I don't think that they're the enemy or anything like that. They're trying to make good calls, and they're trying to assist the fire chief to make good calls for their departments. I think there's other things that we can look at besides VO2 max, like things like body composition, muscle strength, movement quality. There's a number of things we can go down. But I think the fire chief has that ability to use the NFPA 1580 standards as a starting place, and then start to ask additional questions when he or she needs to. And this conversation is just the beginning of that, I think, to the fire chief.
Okay. Well, thanks, good dudes. You're the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. It's been AZ and Mike Conner and Jake. And oh, hold on. One quick announcement. Frontline Mobile Health is our platinum sponsor for our Women's Tactical Human Performance Summit next year, May 29th. I'm very excited about it. Thank you again. And now we are officially out.
See ya.
See ya.
Bye.